This is a strange encounter I had well over a decade ago. In fact, probably about 16 years or so now. I used to hang out with a guy named Jeremy constantly. We were almost always together, really good friends. He lived in a town a bit away from where I'm now calling Fosterburg. The back half of this town was mostly farms and wooded areas, more or less the country, as we called it then. His nearest neighbor was about 10 minutes away, if walking on foot. During the summers, we'd take turns spending the nights at one another's houses nearly every night. He'd stay at mine for a night, then I'd stay at his. We'd often walk back and forth between our houses, even though it was an hour-and-a-half walk. Our favorite thing to do was stay up all night playing video games, usually RPGs. This was during the 16-bit era, SNES times, going into the N64 times. And when we'd get bored or one of us had been playing too long, we'd often sneak out of his house and go exploring. As I said, he lived in a pretty rural area, so there was always somewhere new to go. We'd often grab up some flashlights and bring a stick, bat, or knife with us and go exploring in the backwoods. On this particular night, we'd left around 3 a.m. or so. We were crossing through a cornfield, cracking dirty jokes the whole time, when we came to a clearing leading into a new set of woods we'd never been into. So we decided to go ahead and check it out. The woods were thick, and dawn was starting to show slightly. A bit of light was coming out when we'd made it pretty far in. We decided we should probably start heading back home to make sure we snuck back in before his parents got up for work and noticed us missing. We'd probably spent a good hour or so getting this far. As we were turning around to go back through, Jeremy noticed what looked like a little, and I mean very little shack, 100 or so feet in front of us. He mentioned considering to explore it, but I was starting to get a bad feeling thinking about it. It kinda creeped me out. We instead decided we'd just explore for 10-15 minutes or so around it and then leave. Maybe come back later in full daylight. Dawn was coming, but it was still pretty dark, though we could see to navigate through the woods without the need of flashlights now. Of course, even in full daylight, it's always still darker in the dense woods due to the canopy overhead. So we went snooping a bit, taking in the little shack. It was rickety looking, had 2 windows. One was almost entirely broken out, some of the glass even still on the ground outside. We were taking in the side of the place. It was rectangular shaped. The door wasn't on our side. We were being pretty quiet because, for whatever reason, our overactive imaginations kept assuming someone was inside the thing, sleeping or something. We stepped around to the side that would be the front of the shack with the door, and there was this little clearing several feet in front of us. There was a big tree stump, and a man was sitting on it. This immediately made us halt and barely breathe. He didn't seem to notice us. It was still pretty dark, as I'd said, so it was hard to make out a whole lot, but the guy looked pretty tall and kind of broad-shouldered. We stood there staring for a few seconds, unsure how to react without making enough noise to alert the guy. I was wondering how he hadn't noticed us yet already, actually. The guy stood up suddenly, though, and turned around toward us. He was gigantic. His legs seemed abnormally long, and he stood seriously taller than the shack, which had to have been at least 6.5 feet tall, maybe even 7 foot itself. The guy didn't move at first, but he was holding a wood-cutting axe, and all of a sudden he let out the most horrible-sounding moan I've ever heard in real life, like that of tremendous anguish. As we began to smell something rotten, like roadkill and a rotten egg mixed together, he took 2 steps forward, closing a lot of distance quickly, and we started running. We ran near blindly back through the woods, not even caring where we came out at, as long as it led us back to Jeremy's house. We got back panting and wheezing and just stared at each other, both of us thinking the same thing. which we discussed. Did that really just happen? Jeremy realized that in our hurry to escape the woods, he'd dropped and lost his pocket knife somewhere along the way. It was creepy, and neither of us slept much that night. But 2 days later, we were walking from my house to his. When we got to his front yard, he mentioned that the air smelt terrible. It smelled of rot, like what we'd smelled near the shack in the woods. We got close to the house and noticed a pocket knife sticking out of the tree closest to the house, the very same one Jeremy had lost in the woods. To this day, I cannot explain this, and typing it up here is giving me goosebumps. It's probably the craziest thing I've ever personally experienced. That shook me up for a long time. Had a lot of trouble sleeping for weeks because I'd keep seeing that inhumanly tall man stepping towards me and recall the rank smell that suddenly hit us, along with the terrible moaning that the man let out. Scared the heck out of me, and probably the absolute scariest moment of my life. I don't know what that guy was, who he was, and we never saw him again. We did go back near the shack again once in the daylight a month or so later. My girlfriend at the time heard the story from Jeremy and thought it was a crock of crap to scare her. So we took her out to see the shack. We didn't stick around long enough for anything to happen, if it would have. But on our way back, she said the atmosphere of the place really creeped her out, and she wanted to get back home. I have always been an avid outdoorsman, always hunted, always fished. I'm from Missouri, and I know what we have and what we don't have. We have a few mountain lions scattered around and even fewer black bears. The only common thing that are big and wild are deer, coyotes, and turkeys. Our farm is situated on bluffs and ridges along the Missouri River in the center of the state, and while it's actually pretty populated, the terrain is incredibly rough and hard to get around on. That being said, our acreage isn't huge, but the surface area is. All kinds of ravines, gullies, hollows, etc. It was a few years ago when I was halfway through undergrad and went home on a weekend during bow season. So it's a half-hour drive from the house to the farm, and I show up well before daylight. As luck would have it, I forgot my keys to my dad's box stand. That didn't bother me much, though, because, like I said, rough terrain. It isn't hard to find a spot that sits over a game trail where I can have some elevation and cover. All I had was a pack with some stuff like a knife, rope, tags, my bow, and a little LED flashlight. I took off down the side of a ridge and found a good little spot where I could lean against a tree that overlooked a trail with some brush in front of me for cover. I got there probably too early, and there was no sign of daylight yet, especially considering how thick the woods were. I had been standing there for half an hour, maybe 45 minutes, and then I heard a pack of coyotes. Like I said, not unusual. We have those. What I didn't like was that I was on the ground with only a bow in the dark, and the yips and howls were getting closer. I've never heard of them bothering people, but you know how surprised animals freak out. So I was getting ready to maybe arrow a coyote and was listening intently to where they were. As they came closer, I noticed something bigger was with them. My initial thought was that they were chasing a deer. They were really tearing up the leaves as they came, and the yipping and howling was right there with them. They must have passed me maybe 30 or 40 yards down the hillside, went right on without noticing me at all. So I kind of eased up. I probably wasn't going to have to shoot anything for a while yet. Right when I was relaxed, I heard this long, loud whoa coming from right behind me. I don't think I've ever jumped up, spun around, and drawn a bow so fast. After about a minute, I let off the draw, but I kept my release on the string. I didn't move for another hour, not till I could see a ways without a light. After the sun came up enough, I walked out very slowly and kept looking behind me. got the truck, and went home. I was totally done hunting for the weekend. Like I've said, I've been in those woods my entire life, and I've never heard anything like that. Thought about owls and looked up every owl call I could find, and none of them were like that. The only thing that I've heard that sounds like that are supposed Bigfoot vocalizations. At any rate, the whole thing was weird. I would never have thought it was so remotely possible for something like that, if they exist at all, to be found in Missouri, so close to civilization. Of course, after I did some Googling, I found other cases of Missouri settings, and a lot of them. I would never have thought it was remotely possible for something like that, if they exist at all, to be found in Missouri, so close to civilization. A long time ago, my friend Jason and I were prone to getting involved in many types of misadventures. And this one, while seemingly pointless at the start, proved to be one to remember. While I am uncertain of the name of the campsite in question, I do know that it was one my father and I had visited on many occasions. One particular night, after a lousy day of fishing, Jason and I decided that hiding in the brush overlooking the river, as darkness set in around us, would offer a great opportunity to see the night come alive. And it kind of did. We heard rather than saw bats overhead as they picked off insects over the open water. We saw raccoons and even some deer that strolled through the dark, wary of anything out of the ordinary. The familiar sounds of buzzing insects and chirping crickets berated our ears, reminding us where we were and that there was life all around us. But even reminders have a tendency to go mute. The silence was not an abrupt one, but rather a dying down, swooping steadily over us from one side to the other. The clicks and chirps from the bats stopped. The buzzing and flying insects around us retreated. Having been accustomed to outdoor evening antics, my friend and I both understood that, at that point, we were less alone than we had been previously. Where was the threat coming from, though? And what could it be? We both had our minds set on it being something like a coyote, or possibly a mountain lion. Whatever it was, we knew that staying still was our best option. Long minutes passed in shared silence, broken only by our shallow breaths of expectancy, as we strained our eyes in the darkness, trying to pick out anything moving through the leafed canopy and ground brush. A group of crickets to our left started to chirp again, less lively than before, and we thought that perhaps any sign of danger had passed. Suddenly there was a strange scent in the air, earthy and musky. Where was it coming from, though? I was about to stand up and head back to camp, while we could still find it, when an odd shape seemed to detach itself from the trees before us, close to the riverbank. My heart stopped in my throat. The form was huge, almost monstrous in size, but strangely human in its movement. It cast a heavy gaze to the right and to the left before beckoning to another unseen form, still hiding from our shared line of sight. What was going on here? In no time, another form, smaller than the other, came out of the brush and scurried to join the larger one at the edge of the stream. Jason and I were curious, though equally frightened over what we were seeing. Was this a mother and child drinking from the river? Huge hands attached to the long arms scooped water from the river and brought it up to the face and rubbed it over the hair on its arms and body. They're bathing, I thought. Whatever we had stumbled upon was bathing both parent and child. Jason and I watched in interest. The only thought I was dwelling on was how quiet these beings were. Their movements over the terrain were absolutely silent. Eventually, the two left their place along the river and melted back into the black of trees around us. Long minutes of uncertainty passed before the insect noises started up again, and we knew that we were safe to head back through the bramble to camp again. The meeting, though brief, had left the two of us with little question as to the validity that there may be something else out there, uncertain, unidentified, but absolutely alive and well. Not a pro, but more than 1,000 days in the back country over the past decade. I have been drawn to the wild. It seems like home, and I generally know my neighbors out there. Not afraid to be in the deep woods, in the dark. Love my woods. One sunny weekday afternoon, I had dirt biked up an old mining road. It gained a couple thousand feet from the valley floor towards the ridges of the Cascades. When the road gave out near the bottom of a high basin, I put on my backpack and started off cross-country toward the ridge. It was still heavily forested, old growth and old cut fading in another 1,000 feet into those scraggly, wind-blown ones near the top. About 20 minutes in, and about half a mile up from me, near the tree line, I heard this thumping sound. It was very odd, so I stopped to listen carefully. It sounded like a big, solid branch was being whacked against a solid tree. I used the term solid because its hits were powerful. One or both of the pieces of wood were hard and dry. The wood resonated and rang on impact as dry wood will. I couldn't get over the power, though. It sounded like someone was swinging a 4-inch post. Weird, right? Well, it gets better. This someone sounded like they were trying to communicate. The thumping had a very complex and well-defined pattern. And here's the weirdest part. The thumping signal occasionally became very rapid, like what a drummer could do if they were noodling around with a stick. But I swear, it sounded like a 4-inch post was being treated lightly as a drumstick. I listened for maybe 5 minutes, just fascinated with this sound, this code, and the power of it. Then the drumming suddenly stopped, and I kind of woke up to the fear of this unknown thing out there. I had my pistol, I had my bear spray, and my knife. I really only fear cougars, and even then, I figure they'll have a bad day trying to take me down. Still, the silence as I started into the forest ahead seemed loaded, and I turned on my heels and left that valley. That place and that experience gave me the chills, and that high valley won't see my shadow again. So I believe it was May 13th, 2012. I had taken a train to Olympia, Washington, and then hitched the rest of the way to Westport because I wanted to learn to surf. Anyway, after renting a surfboard and flailing around in the water for a day or two, it was getting close to sunset, and I had to find a place to sleep. I found out that it was illegal to sleep on the beach, but someone suggested that I go down to Grayland State Park. Not only did I have the option of paying for a campsite, but I could find a place to lay my stuff down and sleep without being bothered. So I hitched down Highway 105 to the park and decided against buying a campsite and hiked through the woods to the beach. I found a couple of small landmarks to remind where my things were and set them down. I was surprised at how empty the area was. There was one RV with the blinds down and a couple fast asleep in another campsite. Otherwise, it was deserted as I sat disappointed that the bathroom had no electricity. I smoked a long cigar and enjoyed my time alone. Night fell, and I began to walk back towards my impromptu beach camp when I realized I couldn't see a darn thing. The moon was relatively bright, but the wind was intense, and the forest canopy blocked the moonlight. I continued walking through the trees with my hands out in front of me, so I didn't hit anything. At this point, I was a little creeped out. Dark, empty woods at night are creepy. Howling wind that covers any other sound is creepy. But I pressed on because I'm more adventurous than that. Besides, The beach was easy to find. Just walk west until you reach the Pacific. Big ocean. Can't miss it. I came out onto the beach, and none of my landmarks were there. I might have gone a little north or south, I didn't know, but I thought the dim light from my cell phone could help me find that weird rock marker near the edge of the woods. I went back into the forest. Never had I thought that I could be so lost in such a small area. I couldn't have been more than half a mile from my things. And yes, the woods are creepy, but I'll hang in there until the scream. Directly behind and to my right, I heard the most startling howl. I jumped, swore, and began to run. I don't know what it was, and I didn't want to find out. I couldn't run too fast because I couldn't see. The noise continued, although I was getting further from it. That was encouraging. So I ran a little faster until I slammed my left shoulder into a tree that I didn't see. Barely catching myself, I slowed down despite the adrenaline, and as I slowly walked, I remember reading that these are contained screech owls. Well, shoot, I thought. Screech owls are startling. Eventually I came back to the beach, wandered up and down until I found my stuff, and went to sleep. That was 2 summers ago. Earlier this year, after getting interested in Bigfoot, I was telling someone my story. They asked if I could send them a recording of a western screech owl. So I Googled it. I couldn't actually find a recording that matched what I heard. Screech owls have several calls, but this one was not one of them. Weird, I thought. Then later I found out that Gary's Harbor County, where I was, has some of the highest number of BFRO reports in Washington. What I heard wasn't the famous whoop howl, but it was similar in pitch and unbelievably loud. I'd hardly call a scary noise in the woods proof of an undiscovered ape, but that's my story. About 15 years ago, I lived in Sulphur, Oklahoma. My playground, the Chickasaw National Recreation Area. I loved that park so much. I rode more miles on my bike than anywhere else. I've walked nearly every trail and rode every road. Every day I would ride my mountain bike up and down the trails and would be home by nightfall most days. One night, however, I had rode out a bit further than usual. On my way back, however, I decided to ride the trail from an area known as Buffalo Springs, where they have live buffalo roam and there is a large spring/fountain for all to enjoy. As I was riding back, I knew the end of the trail was coming up and I would have to cross a stone bridge across the creek, then up the road to my home. It was dark at this time, and all I had to use to see was the full moon. I was about maybe a few hundred yards from it when I got a sharp pain in my left thigh. I stopped and looked around to see what had just hit me, then a noise sounding like something hitting the ground hard in front of me. There was a rock, just about the size of a baseball, rolling across the trail. Me, confused, starts to look up the side of the hill. Just as I turn my head to look, I almost fall off my bike when another rock comes flying down, hitting the front of my wheel. I finally have my eyes adjust to look and see someone very tall and dark and covered in hair at the top of the hill, throwing things at me and screaming. I yelled that I had a cell phone and was going to call the police. I didn't actually have one, as I didn't have a cell phone yet. This seemed to have angered it. He started charging down the hill at me. I, for obvious reasons, light up bike and took off. Just as I crossed the bridge, I hear a huge splashing noise in the creek, and seen it was a large rock that had been thrown. I was in the clear to home, but was frightened all the way there. I went to the ranger station later the next morning and told a ranger I knew about what happened. He says, "So, you were attacked by a Bigfoot?" snidely laughing. I said, "I don't know what it was, but something was trying to hurt me out there." Okay, Justin, if I have any more Bigfoot, I'll let you know what we get. I just said fine and left. The very next week, I was riding, in the daylight, when PR pulled up next to me and said to get in. I asked why. He said he needed to show me something. We head up to the police department in town. Before we got out of the car, he turns to me and says, Justin, I have to give you a huge apology. I'll be honest that I didn't believe you when you told me the story of you being attacked. However, it has come to my attention that a couple was out in the same area last night and was attacked in the same way, saying they had seen a large, hairy creature throwing rocks and sticks and screaming at them. They called the police, and they came out, and some of the other rangers, including myself. I immediately thought about what you had told me. When we arrived and started up the hill, sure enough, we were having rocks and things thrown at us. Guns drawn and yelling, two officers tackled a man to the ground. He was 6'5" tall, naked, covered in mud, and had long hair and a large beard. He had escaped from the Veterans Center across Veterans Lake. Apparently, he thought he was back in Vietnam and he was trying to take out the enemy. PR said I was very lucky because he was trying to kill me. We went inside so I could give the police my statement as to what had happened. They had him sent to a more secure facility somewhere else. To this day, I still get shivers when I hike that trail, and I always keep my eyes on the ridge top. I do feel bad for ones with PTSD and such mental illness, but crazy Mr. Bigfoot man, let's not meet again. I hope you enjoyed tonight's scary stories. If you did, remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons. If you have a story that you would like read on this channel, please send it to me at madamhorror1@gmail.com. Join me next time for more tales of the unknown.